we have time for 10 minutes for question answers, and I will shoot off 2 questions. You don't have to answer it. We can club it around with other questions. One, what has been the response of various international human rights organizations and various organizations working in the realm of refugees to the stance of Bangladesh? Are they pushing Bangladesh government to be a little more considerate given that they are taking to high seas, or is that aspect completely being neglected? Then the second dimension I have a question is, how does this work? Because if you are getting onto high seas, it's a pretty desperate thing. But does that have a network of smugglers? And if those smugglers are there, what is their country of origin? And who facilitates their movement? It would be a fascinating explanation for us. And any other questions? I see one hand there. Yes, sir. Please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much. I really enjoyed all the presenters speaking on various dimensions. My question is specifically directed to Dr. Priyanka. She had, very extensively covered on the Rohingyas in India. My question is related to Rohingyas in India. I come from Jammu, and there are, as you mentioned, a lot of pockets where the Rohingya has been living there, and I've interacted with Rohingyas. Even I surprised to see Rohingyas in Jammu. First time it's like a surprise that are these Rohingyas or Gujars or some sort of it. Later I also developed some kind of interest to understand why are they here and what are the, how are they being engaged in with the workforce. It's a very interesting story that I would share with you later on. My question is that what I learned from that, whatever the minimum interactions which I had with this Rohingyas is that I'm just even wondering about that the role of Government of India in these issues. What is that stand? Because it seems to me there is some specific reasons for putting up these migrants, because I cannot say they are illegally migrated into India like the Bangladeshis, because it seems there is a design behind it that they should be kept in even the outskirts of Delhi, in Hyderabad and Jammu, or for some reasons. For Jammu, I can tell you that what reasons could begin that Rohingyas, because those serve the minority, especially the Gujar Muslim communities, kind of a labor force for them, like a housemaid and other things, because they don't get Hindu laborers in Jammu region. That's a blunt, very brute fact, but it is true. That's the case. So I am not able to comprehend that the Government of India's policy. So if you could give some insight into it, that what is our stand, what is our policy, and was there any specific reasons began to keep these Rohingyas in the Muslim pockets like Hyderabad and Delhi and things. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Uday, Rahul and Suparna. Uday, please.
I think, again, it is a very complex and a complicated issue which I think the Myanmar government has not been able to fully resolve, and the international community also has not been very helpful in the matter either. The automatic reaction of the international community is of linking it with terrorism. Now, if the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh become easy recruiting ground for terrorist organizations in West Asia, and if the developments in neighboring Indonesia also encourage the role of terrorist organizations in amongst the Rohingya refugees, then actually we have a very serious problem on hand. And the way national governments and the international community is responding to this crisis is to say the least very inadequate. considering the seriousness of the issue, I think I'll stop here. Yeah.
One more question and then Rahul.
Well, mine is more sort of comment than a question, but I'd certainly like the panelists to respond to that. I beg to disagree with the point that Myanmar has to be squarely blamed for what is happening in the country. There is a history behind it. The panelists have spoken on it, and I'm sure this issue will keep coming and keep bothering us in the next 2 days. But certainly Rohingyas is not one issue on which you can blame, put the blame on Myanmar and go away. You have to look at the history, you have to look at the region's politics, and therefore, as ASEAN, in the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, it has already been said that it's a regional problem now. It is beyond Myanmar and Bangladesh's hands, and you have to find a regional solution to this regional problem. And now, what is that regional solution is something that the countries of this region have to look at. And certainly leaving those people on the high seas is not an option. But also, and certainly Myanmar has more responsibility than others in terms of looking at this issue. But Bangladesh also cannot wash its hands off of this problem. The second is we have to also look at it domestically. A Myanmarese person and an official would be the best source to tell you as to how complicated and entrenched this problem is. But then you have to dissociate the human rights problem with the women issues. For example, Professor Priyanka mentioned of this, issue of childbirths, and there has to be a gap of 3 years. Looking at the Rakhine region and the state of affairs there, the kind of poverty they have and lack of hygiene and health infrastructure, I don't see a problem with this. I mean, you have to also look at the welfare of women also in that region. So I think we have to look at both human rights and the women rights in those parts of the country.
Before you answer, His Excellency is keen to.
Well, actually, what I have is just one thing is to supplement what Ms. Ramya has said just now about the Tamadol and the evolution of the Tamadol. And I just want to add one fact that that might be escape the notice of the scholars, is that if you look at our army, up to 1988, all our weapons came from the West. In 1988, there was an arms embargo imposed on us. And the army find itself without no source for its equipment. And the only one that was willing to sell arms to Myanmar was China. It was not that, to tell you very frankly, we were so impressed with the Chinese weaponry or we were so enamored with China. But it was through force of circumstances. Because we have always depended on the West for our arms, or even from India. And let me, just since I have the floor, just one add one historical note. I think, of course, most of you are familiar. In 1948, when the insurgency was at the height, and the Myanmar government was in the danger of being overthrown, it was the Indian 25-pounder artillery pieces which helped turn the tide. And we never forgot this fact. And we also have, of course, our military relations with India. Because I want to put this in perspective, because why we have to turn to China And because up to, until 1988, we never had any arms from China. All our arms were from the West, or from Israel, or from the then Yugoslavia, mostly. Regarding the Rohingya case issue, well, of course, I think in the interest of time, I will not go into the details of our position, which is quite well known to all of you. But I have one reservation about the statement made by you, Dr. When you said that I may have been mistaken, but as I understand, when you said that sectarian violence is growing and getting worse, because you gave the impression that that was made from the statement was as though this is happening now. As the sectarian violence, the last major incident, happened in 2012, 2 years ago. And we have been trying to resolve by having interfaith discussions and trying to find our ways. In fact, our organization, the Myanmar Institute of Strategic and International Studies, is also looking at this question. Yes, you know, the figures, I also have some problems with your figures. You know, let us say there are all sorts of figures, between 800,000 to 1.4 million, what we call Bengalis and what people call Rohingyas in our country. But the thing is that we know that they are within our border, these people. And in the census, you know, what we try to do is that when we conducted the census, was that we try to include them. But only one problem was that we said we cannot accept the term Rohingya because that was never in any of our constitutions. And that is why that is a problem. That is why that I have some problem with your statement saying that sectarian violence is growing and getting worse, because it implies that it is going on today, which is, I'm not very sure, is the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all your questions. I hope I do justice to my attempts to answer them. First of all, Sanjay, there is a difference when we say refugees come from Myanmar and economic migrants from Bangladesh. As the UN definition for refugees goes, a person who is categorized as a refugee is someone who is fleeing persecution on 5 grounds. And here so is granted the refugee status. And India gave that refugee status to Bangladeshis post 1971 when we brought them in. And then once Bangladesh was created, Indira Gandhi said, you're no longer refugees, you're all supposed to go back. So world over now, Bangladeshis are not considered as refugees. They are given the terminology of migrants. So the burden of asking them to take them back is not there, and to take them in. You just say that they are economic migrants and they're fleeing flooding, poverty, overpopulation. So Bangladesh does not come into the burden sharing international forum with that perspective, whereas Myanmar and India and all the others would come in. Now, again, the remaining South Asian countries still don't, because none of us, other than Sri Lanka, we have not signed the UN Refugee Convention. And we do not have a UN refugee, we do not have per se a governmental policy on refugees in India. Neither are we signatories, nor do we even have a regional framework Professor Chimney, with whom I worked for a couple of years, we had tried to formulate a model refugee law, but that has still not come up to a level at which it can be passed as a legislation. And for very obvious reasons, because the minute it becomes a law, you are bound under sovereignty to, give the, refoulement and give status like that. Now, so that first of all answers the question that we do not have a refugee law. What do we have? We have an ad hoc refugee policy that works as and when suits the political expediency of the Indian state. When it suits us, when we want to be the Chanakyan logic of friends, friends, enemies, enemies, your friend, so we welcome the Tibetan refugees. When our Prime Minister gets assassinated, we throw all the Sri Lankan refugees into camps, into prison-like conditions. When we want to have good relations with the Myanmarese government, we close up all our borders with the northeastern states and do not allow any of the Myanmarese refugees to come in. When you want to show the world you are a good host, then you do take in some. So it has exactly been expediency which has driven refugee policy in India. Afghanistan, the Afghani refugees, the Tibetan refugees have been the ones who have been the best taken care of. Now, of course, high seas and the network of smuggling is a very, very well-known fact. And there is a lot of literature today on international trafficking, which works and overlaps with migration. Migration studies have shown that trafficking links are continuously working at the same point of time. When you have migration flows, you will have trafficking flows exploiting. This is human trafficking, there is sex trafficking, there is slave trafficking, and the images that we've been getting in our media right now are, kind of totally illustrating this. Yes, in fact, I would recommend that while my article on the refugees in in Hyderabad is going to get published very soon, we have Mr. Ravi Nair based in Delhi, who is particularly doing the study on the Jammu refugees, the Rohingya refugees. And so we are, in fact, next month we are going to be at a workshop in Darjeeling where we are going to look at various papers on Rohingya refugees from all over the country. And we are looking at a full publication out of it. So it is labor which draws you away, and as you said it very well, Delhi is small. Delhi still does have a few Rohingya camps where you have Rohingyas living in certain pockets in Delhi, but they have moved northwards. When the first information started coming in from Jammu, all of us in the refugee networks were very surprised that why Jammu. But then it is wherever they can find a place and they can live and they get some solidarity and community networks to go in there. Now the UNHCR in New Delhi has agreed to give refugee status to the Rohingya refugees. And Sir, Your Excellency, the figures that I have quoted is from a mail that I have received on the 1st of June from the UNHCR office in New Delhi, because this paper was going in for publication, and they have given me these exact figures that as of 1st of June 2015, there are 8,836 Rohingya refugees and 2,434 Rohingya asylum seekers that are registered with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in India. And among them, we have collected this data from various organizations in Hyderabad. Around 1,400 persons are currently residing in Hyderabad only. So this is the figures that I have from the 1st of June. And well, I can just say that when you make a statement that sectarian violence is not worsening, well, from a human rights and an activist perspective, you can just counterpose it with the argument that if in Hyderabad 5 years ago there were only 100 Rohingya refugees, and 5 years later that figure has shot up to 2,000 as registered by the UNHCR, then why is it so? When the UNHCR gives an asylum and a refugee card to a refugee coming from Myanmar, the refugee officer has undergone that whole process, legal process, to determine that that person has been fleeing violence from the home country. So just these numbers themselves, I think so, are, if I may say, just an explicative proof of the rising incidence of violence in the home country from where these, refugees are fleeing. So if I'm making a broad sweeping statement there, it is a reflection of the growing numbers that I'm accounting here, sir. That's all I would like to say there. When it comes to Uday's point on securitization, well, my paper on the Rohingya refugees in Hyderabad actually stemmed from that one little incident where a suspected Rohingya refugee from Hyderabad was picked up because of the Bodh Gaya blasts in 2013, and then again the example that she's been talking about. And along with the trafficking linkages with migration, today we see this overarching securitization debate, and that is that migrants, people fleeing poverty, violence, are those who are also willing to, if told for ideology's sake and for religion's sake, to feed their families, to take up arms. When we have the Pakistani Taliban giving a call and asking people who are, getting into these boats and staying stranded in the seas to come and openly give the clarion call that come, pick up your arms and kill. And that's only when you're going to get bread to eat. Then it is very much explicative of the very dangerous signs and networks that we can see coming up. I don't want to be provocative here to say that, yes, there is, it is, refugees are terrorists. That is what the state perspective always is. There is one or two examples, and this leads to the securitization of the debate. This leads to countries which can welcome more asylum seekers, close their doors, close their borders, and say that we are not going to take in our quota of people who need to be taken in. Because at the end of the day, the international refugee law appeals on just one moral principle, and that is the principle of non-refoulement. And it just tells us simply that if at your doorstep you have a person who is fleeing for his life, and who, if you close the door on his face and you make him go back and he can die, then you as the host nation should at least let him step inside your house. What we do later is something for international consultation. But refoulement, the principle of refoulement, is customary international law binding on all nations in the United Nations. And on that basis, we appeal to everybody's morality for refugees. Well, I hope just a few questions answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Ramya.
Sir, I completely agree with you in saying that before 1988, a lot of these arms were from the West. I even listed them out in terms of Yugoslavia, USA, UK, and Japan. I also have a lot of works that suggest that before 1988, Burma's arm imports were very modest. It initially received some assistance from the US, UK, and India, but as soon as the isolationist policy followed by the sanctions started, there was an attempt to adopt and stray away from foreign sanctions, because of which a lot of the data that I presented showed that the arms acquisitions were from the PRC, not that there was any enamoring in that regard. I hope that clears my point. Thank you.
I'm sure many of you have lot more questions to ask, but
let's end the session here now, and I presume we are breaking for tea.
Yes.
And we can carry forward our conversations over a cup of tea and come back. We started 20 minutes late, so we are closing 20 minutes behind schedule. And it has been a very interesting session. We have seen some very passionate presentations, and we have seen some really sharp responses from the floor, and that's how it should be. And congratulations to the organizers for putting together such a wonderful team for this session, and speakers from floor who have asked really nice questions. And let's take a break and come back after a cup of tea. Thank you.